this is Tom Jennings with BackstageAxxess, and we're backstage here at the Tralf in Buffalo, New York, with the legendary Todd Rundgren. Todd, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, I was in Buffalo anyway, so seemed to be a way to kill a couple birds with one stone. Here we are.
All right, now you're currently touring in support of the Alma Robert Johnson covers that you agreed to do as part of the deal to get Arena released, and you played a lot of these shows, Robert Johnson material. Are you happy with the way that deal turned out?
Ultimately, yeah, we're having a lot of fun with it. There was in the back of my mind at one point the idea of someday doing kind of like a blues-oriented record, you know, something that is generally pretty simple and straight ahead and fun to play. And so the deal that ultimately had me make this record. At first, I was apprehensive about it because Eric Clapton has been tributing Robert Johnson pretty exclusively in the last several years, so I was a bit trepidatious at the beginning about how I was going to approach it, but I ultimately decided I would do it like Eric Clapton would have done it in 1965 or something like that. I kind of modeled it after the blues bands of the 60s, and particularly those out of England. So gave me an opportunity to play a lot of guitar. Essentially the approach is make everything an excuse to play guitar. and so since then I've been having kind of having a pretty good time just noodling around with these blues songs. It's an little known fact, I guess, in my first gig when I got out of high school, the first thing I ever got paid to do was play blues guitar in a band that was structured pretty much like the Paul Butterfield band. So it wasn't such an incredible stretch for me to think in those terms.
Was that band Woody's Truck Stops?
That was them, yeah. We never made it much outside of Philadelphia, and by the time I'd been in the band, maybe 9 months, they discovered Grateful Dead and Acid, and they decided to go to the country and get their heads together and write all new music that didn't have anything to do with the blues. And that was when I decided that I would not go to the country and take Acid. Instead, I would steal players from all the local bands and form a band called the Naz, and that was essentially the first band I was in where I actually wrote songs and did a little bit of singing, and eventually learned record production and stuff all through that period, which lasted at least twice as long as Woody's Truck Stop, maybe a whole 18 months or something like that. But we did manage to get 2 album projects done in that period of time.
And you've come back and you're starting to play. Well, you've been playing Open My Eyes for a long time, but now you're playing Kitty Boy on this tour. How was that, playing that song again?
Well, it's a lot of fun, and it's part of the evidence that I present to the audience that I do have some blues influence in my background, as well as covering the Robert Johnson songs. So it would be kind of a funny show if it was Robert Johnson songs and then Can We Still Be Friends? And things like all these piano ballads. I had to go back and rediscover all the material that I had done that had any sort of blues influence in it. Blues or funk influence, I suppose. There are a few of those as well. And surprisingly, there are songs from just about every era of my career that do have some sort of blues thing about them, including the song that we're playing from Arena as well. We play a blues-tinged ballad from Arena as well. So all the way from, as you mentioned, Kitty Boy, which was on the first Naz album or second Naz album, all the way up to my most recent records, which just came out like 2 summers ago, I guess. So it's in there.
Speaking of albums, I mean, over the last 2 years, coming up to this Labor Day, you're going to be performing Todd and Healing in its entirety. You performed A Wizard, a True Star, on the entire Arena album, the entire Johnson album. You've done the Hollywood Bowl with Beatles material. I mean, I could go on and on. Probably close to 100 songs in the course of 2 years. I mean, you have a photographic memory, or?
Well, part of the album recreations that you mentioned are not really part of my grand plan. There's something that is actually comes back to me from the fan base. They kind of decide which albums they want to hear, and then I decide whether I've got the resources to actually do it. And so here we have 2 years in a row, 2 requests. Well, now it amounts to sort of 3 requests, because it was only Wizard of True Star last year, and this year it's 2 records. It's Todd, which was a double album, and Healing. So it's almost like 3 records this fall, and the one that I did last fall. So it's starting to mount up, the amount of material, but it's always easier for me than it is for the players that I have to hire. The Wizard show really kind of almost killed Roger Powell. Just the amount of playing that he had to do, what he had to remember, and the fact that he had not been out on the road in such a long time came as a shock to him. The whole thing. And so he had more fun, as I recall, when he went back to his regular day job at Electronic Arts, and then came to see us when we played in, I believe it was the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. And he said he really enjoyed the show, but especially because he didn't have to play it. So I figure that the players are the ones who have to go through the most amount of labor, because most of them have not lived through the music in the first place or ever played most of it before.
And you've done the arrangements for both albums, sent them out to the band members by now for Todd and Healing?
Well, we try and do them pretty literally. What I do is I go back to the original master tapes, the multi-track masters, and then I do remixes of everything with the emphasis on the keyboards if it's for the keyboard players, or vocals for the vocal parts, and guitars for the guitars. So they get to essentially hear a special mix, but I'm not prolific enough to write out charts. So I let everyone kind of notate it the way that they're most comfortable. And some people write it down, and some people just memorize it. So it's not all charts and conducting and things like that. It's really mostly rehearsal. I expect them to be familiar with it, and then we make corrections while we're in rehearsal. But rehearsal is really not for learning it; it's for learning how to play it all together. And there will be elements of staging, probably more than what the band had to deal with the last time. I was the one who pretty much took over all of the staging aspects, in as much as I had 12 costume changes through the course of an hour's worth of music. And this time I'm not going to do so many costume changes, but I am going to have the band a little bit more particularly choreographed, depending on the tunes that we're doing, things like that. So we'll have more rehearsal, we'll have more on-stage rehearsal for this particular couple of albums than we did for Wizard.
And the original version of Sons of 1984 was recorded on 2 coasts.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty innovative concept, never done before or since. Any thoughts on how you're going to recreate that on stage, or is that kind of a secret?
Well, everybody on this side of the audience, you're New York. Everybody on this side of the audience, you're San Francisco. Yeah, that should be pretty easy to figure out. Just divide them down the middle and have them sing what I presume are words that they now remember. Originally, of course, we had to print out lyric sheets, and I had to actually teach the audience the part that they were supposed to sing before we did the recording. Of course, I'm not going to take the time to do that now. If they don't know it, then they'll just have to follow the lips of their neighbors. Somebody's bound to know it.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And last year, you had a very successful appearance there during the Akron gig, the first night of the Wizard of True Star in between the two shows, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
You just recently did a chef jam there.
Yeah, that was fun.
Well, this has kind of created the thought. You're one of those people that is mentioned often as someone who's deserving of going into the Hall of Fame as either an artist, a producer, or both, certainly for your contribution. What are your thoughts on it?
I don't think much about it. You know, I never thought that there should have been a Rock Hall of Fame in it. And for the most part, the Grammy Awards focus on pop music anyway.
Right.
And so year to year, most people are getting awarded, you know, are being recognized for their musical achievements. The whole idea of the Rock Hall of Fame seemed to me antithetical to the spirit of the music, which was, you know, originally it was supposed to be kids' music, and old people were supposed to say it sounded awful. And that was essentially, you know, for the longest time, you know, up until the Beatles. I mean, certainly when Elvis was there, it was a whole generational thing. You know, the parents thought he was scandalous, and girls wanted to marry him, and boys wanted to be him. And then, of course, the Beatles came along, and they got this whole other sort of acceptance going. You know, when Frank Sinatra starts recording Beatles songs, then that whole generational line gets blurred. And even though at first they were, you know, particularly when they started advocating taking acid and things like that, they were very anti-establishment. Then it wasn't until like so-called punk rock, and you know, a decade or so later, that an anti-establishment musical form became popular. And then all through the 80s, that kind of petered out, and then it became grunge rock, or I think in the 80s it was probably hip-hop was the anti-establishment music, and anti-establishment music, and in the late 80s, early 90s it was punk rock, and we haven't really had anything since then. But it isn't about the things that get established, you know, rock music or the thing, whatever you call it, that made rock music happen, that is a cyclic thing that comes around every once in a while, and is usually, you know, specifically youth oriented. You know, it's the kids' music. And I try and keep a youthful attitude about what I do. I try to enjoy it the same way that I did when I first started doing it. And indeed, in many ways, I enjoy it more. I have a greater comfort level performing on stage than I used to have. And I don't envy other people for being in the Rock Hall of Fame, but I never think, oh, I wish I was there, or anything like that. It's great for the city of Cleveland, but in terms of an overarching credibility, and in terms of kind of music that I care about, it's never really been a factor.
You could talk a little bit about, speaking of your music, and kind of come around to your fans. Read an article in Rolling Stone once that said, from 1974, you probably don't remember the quote, but I'll throw it to you. When I make an album, it's like pouring hot water on an ant colony, and as soon as people hear about it, they run out and tell all their friends. You have a very loyal fan base, and now, especially through Rundgren Radio, your fans have kind of are starting to flock to you again. I mean, has that made things better for you?
Well, a lot of people have had, you know, spectacular careers that lasted like 10 years. And that's because you appeal to let's say, a general musical consumer, dilettante artists, and dilettante audiences, really. You know, they're interested in whatever's happening now, but they don't become like super attached to a particular artist. or they're into the celebrity of an artist, but when an artist is no longer a celebrity, they don't have any interest in what the artist does any longer, in the music and in anything that they're necessarily involved in. And fortunately for me, I have an audience of a certain character that is really interested in the music. So, yeah, my audience has been interested in not only the music that I make and has kind of kept up with it all these years, but also the other things that I'm involved in, the internet and computers and that sort of thing. So that's enabled me to have what's now a 45-year career, 40, a little less than that. Let's make it 43. Excuse me. And yeah, I kind of, I always acknowledge the fact that if it was not for the devotion of my audience, I likely would have had to retire or find some other thing to do. As a matter of fact, record production having gone, or going the way that the whole record industry is going, which is becoming more depressed. There are fewer records being made, or certainly fewer records being made by labels who usually are the ones who pay for a producer's expenses. Yeah, there's a lot less production than that used to be what I depended on for my living. So I've had to make up for it by touring more. And fortunately, I've got enough devoted fans out there that I can continue to do that. And the only thing that's required, I suppose, is for me to continue to evolve or continue to change what I'm doing. So going back and recreating old albums from the 70s, that's essentially changing what I'm doing for a while. But everyone knows that I'm not going to play those albums forever. I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to go back to writing again, and I'll come up with another album sometime in the not too distant future, and hopefully it'll be something that continues to sustain that fan loyalty so that I can continue to play.
I'm sure you'll be able to sustain fan loyalty. Final question. It seems like you're going to be hitting the stage pretty soon.
Pretty soon, yeah.
We touched on it briefly before the camera got running, but keyboards. I mean, for a long time, you went out, you had a piano on stage. Funny story, I came to the Tralf a few years ago and we walked into the show and some guy was standing there going, "Where's the piano? Where's the piano?" I mean, I know you don't play it on stage. Do you use it as a writing tool or anything anymore? I mean, do you think you'll get back to it, or is it just something you said, I'm just done with it?
Well, likely I will have to relearn a few songs for these album recreations. I can make somebody else play them, but in one sense it would give me something to do. But in the greater picture, I'm just not that good a piano player to make it the principal instrument when I go out on tour. I rarely, if ever, go through a night without screwing up really bad one of the songs that I'm playing. And it just has to do with the fact that my focus has gotten more on the singing, and my mind share has gone to the singing and out of my hands when I'm playing. The guitar is just an easier instrument to accompany yourself with, mostly because the only one hand is really doing most of the work. The other hand is just banging on the string, so it makes it a little bit more difficult, to make a mistake, and easier to recover from when I do. So, and it took a tour with Joe Jackson to really point this out to me, because he's a real piano player, and he really knows how to play. And by comparison, I really suffered during that tour. So I made a resolution that I wasn't going to accompany myself on piano as a rule, but I will probably on the Todd healing thing play a bit of piano, but not a whole lot.
Well, that's going to be great news. All right. Again, thank you so much, Todd. Thanks for all the years of great music.
All right,
Thank you very much for the interview. I appreciate it.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right.
Some pretty much